Children. The cold that descends on the shores of Lake Superior in late November is not the polite, manageable cold of the city. It does not wait for you to find your gloves or zip your coat. It arrives like a verdict, absolute and without appeal, and it had been hunting Petra Solano for 3 days before the ice finally took her horse. Children. She hadn't meant to ride so far north. She hadn't meant to do a great many things, but the logging road she'd been following had dissolved into white. Children. The trail markers had vanished beneath 2 feet of fresh powder, and the roan mare had gone down hard on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the snow. Children. Snapping her left foreleg with a sound like a rifle shot that sent flocks of ravens screaming out of the spruce trees in every direction. Children. Petra had pulled herself out of the snow and stood there in the howling dark, listening to the animals' breathing go ragged and then still, and she had made herself keep walking because the only other option was to lie down beside the horse and let the cold finish what the storm had started. Children. She was 24 years old, and she had not survived everything she had survived to die on a logging road outside of Wawa, Ontario. Children. She didn't know how long she'd been walking when the light appeared. It was amber and faint, the kind of light a window makes when the person inside has no idea anyone is watching, and it materialized through the blizzard like something she'd imagined. She moved toward it with the stumbling single-mindedness of a woman whose body had already started making decisions without consulting her brain. Children. The cabin was larger than she expected. Squared timbers, a stone chimney pushing dark smoke into the white sky, a woodpile stacked with the obsessive precision of someone who understood that survival was a matter of geometry. She made it to the door and raised her fist and knocked, and the sound of it was so weak against the wind she wasn't sure it counted as knocking at all. Children. The door opened. Children. The man who filled the frame was enormous, not in the soft, broad way of someone who simply ate well. Children. But in the way of someone who had spent years doing physical work in conditions that thinned the unnecessary and reinforced everything else. He had dark hair going silver at the temples. Children. A beard that had not been shaped by anything resembling intention, and eyes that were the particular gray of Lake Superior in autumn, colorless in low light. Children. Startlingly vivid when the light hit them directly. Children. He was holding a kerosene lantern in one hand and a skinning knife in the other, and he looked at Petra the way a man looks at something he has not prepared himself to encounter. Children. I need help, she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in 6 months. Children. He stepped back without a word and let her in. Children. His name was Dex Harlow. She gathered this from an envelope on the table, addressed in someone else's handwriting to a D. Harlow at a rural route number she didn't recognize. He didn't offer the information himself. Children. He moved around the cabin with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to solving problems alone, hanging her soaked coat on an iron hook near the stove, setting a cast-iron pot of something on the burner, saying nothing while she stood dripping onto his floorboards, and tried to remember what warmth felt like. Children. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something else underneath both of those things, something metallic and old. She was too cold to think about what it was. Children. Sit, he said, and indicated a low chair near the stove with a movement of his chin. Children. She sat. Children. The heat hit her in waves. Her hands, which had gone entirely numb somewhere in the second hour of walking, began to ache with the specific, vicious ache of returning circulation. Children. She pressed them between her knees and looked around the room while Dex ladled something into a tin mug. Children. The walls were hung with the practical objects of a man who did not receive company and did not intend to. Snowshoes, coils of rope, A topographical map marked heavily in pencil. Children. A shelf of paperback novels, their spines cracked and faded. A single photograph pinned to the log wall beside the window, but from where she was sitting Petra could not make out the faces in it. Children. He handed her the mug, venison broth, thick with barley, and something she couldn't identify, and so hot it burned the feeling back into her lips in a way that was almost painful. She drank it without stopping, and he watched her do it with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite indifference, but something carefully positioned between the two. Children. Your horse? Children. Back on the logging road. She went down on ice. Petra paused. She's gone. Children. He nodded once. He did not offer condolences, and she did not want them. Children. You're going to need to get out of those wet layers, he said then, and his voice was careful in the way that a man's voice gets careful when he is aware of how a sentence sounds and is trying to acknowledge it without making it worse. Not all of them, but the underlayer is soaked through. You'll go hypothermic overnight if you sleep in wet wool. Children. Petra set the mug down on the floor beside the chair. She was warm enough now that her brain had started working again, which meant she was warm enough for the fear to come back. She crossed her arms over her chest, which was a reflex she couldn't entirely stop, and she felt the bulk of what was strapped beneath her sweater shift against her ribs. Children. I'm fine, she said. Children. Dex looked at her. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because it was disciplined, and the discipline had been practiced long enough that it had become the face's natural resting state. But something moved in his eyes. Not suspicion. Patience. Children. You've been out in that for at least 3 hours, he said. Your lips were blue when I opened the door. I'm not asking you to be comfortable. I'm asking you to not die in my cabin. Children. I said I'm fine. Children. You're not fine. You're in shock and you're wet. And the temperature is going to drop another 10 degrees before morning. He crouched down so that he was at her eye level, which she had not expected from a man his size. And she had the disorienting sense that he was trying to make himself smaller so as not to frighten her further. I'm not going to hurt you. I don't know what you're running from, and I'm not asking, children. But I have a dry flannel shirt and a spare sleeping bag rated to -30. And if you don't take the wet wool off, you're going to be in serious trouble by midnight. Children. Petra looked at him. The fire crackled in the stove. The wind screamed against the window glass and then receded and then screamed again. Children. Please, she said quietly, and her voice came out more fractured than she intended. Please don't. Don't make me take it off. Children. Something shifted in Dex Harlow's face. She could see him recalibrating the way a person does when they realize the situation they're in is more complicated than the situation they thought they were in. He didn't push. He sat back on his heels and waited. Children. There's something, she said. Her teeth had started chattering again despite the warmth. Underneath. If you see it, if anyone sees it, it puts you in danger. I'm not being dramatic. I'm not. She stopped, pressed her hands hard against her sternum. The people who are looking for me will kill anyone who gets in their way. They've already done it once. Children. The silence in the cabin had a different quality now. Children. How far back? Dex said. His voice had changed. It was quieter, and the quieter it got, the more careful it seemed. Children. I don't know. A day, maybe less. The storm will slow them down, but... Children. How many? Children. Petra blinked. It was not the question she had expected. She had expected disbelief, or the particular brand of polite skepticism that people use when they think a woman is being hysterical. She had not expected logistics. Children. 4, she said. Maybe 5. Felix Crane has money and he uses it, so however many he needs. Children. Dex stood up. He walked to the single window and looked out at the dark and the snow for a long moment, and Petra watched the set of his shoulders and tried to determine if she had made an error in judgment coming here. He turned back to face her. "Children, take the wet layers off," he said. "I'm going to check the perimeter and bar the back door. I won't look." He pulled a gray flannel shirt off a peg near the door and set it on the arm of the chair beside her. "Whatever you're carrying, it's your business, but you're no use to yourself or anyone else half frozen." "Children." He went out the back. She heard the bolt slide home. "Children." Petra sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she pulled the soaked wool sweater over her head, and the cold air hit the damp fabric of the harness she wore beneath it, and she thought about how different her life had looked 8 months ago, before she had understood what her father had done. "Children." She left the harness on. She put the flannel shirt over it. She balled the wet sweater up in her lap and sat there holding it when Dex came back through the front door, shaking snow from his shoulders. "Children." He glanced at her once. He didn't ask. "Children." He moved to the stove and refilled her mug without being asked, then pulled a second chair up near the heat and sat down heavily, like a man setting aside a weight he'd been carrying for some time. In the firelight he looked older than she'd first thought, not in a diminished way, but in the way of someone who has lived with considerable intensity for a considerable number of years. "Children." "Felix Crane," he said. Not a question, just the name dropped into the air between them. "Children, you know him." "Children." "I know of him. He owns half the timber rights between here and Chaplow. Him and a man named Aldrich Voss." Dex looked at the fire. "Aldrich Voss was my older brother's business partner 12 years ago." "Children." Petra went very still. "Children." "My brother was a provincial land surveyor," Dex continued. His voice was level, but there was something under the levelness, something that had been compressed and compacted over a very long time. "Children." He found irregularities in the survey records for the northern parcels, discrepancies that suggested the land Crane and Voss were logging had never been legally transferred from the Crown. "Children." The timber rights were fraudulent. "Children." The entire operation was built on falsified documents going back 20 years. He paused. He reported it to the ministry. 3 weeks later, he drove his truck off a bridge outside of Dubroilville. The inquest called it an accident. "Children." "It wasn't an accident," Petra said. "Children." "No," Dex said, "it wasn't." "Children." The fire popped. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls of the cabin with a sound like breathing. "Children." "Aldrich Voss was my father's business partner," Petra said. "My father was a notary. He notarized the land documents. He certified surveys he never saw. On land, he never visited because Voss paid him to, and because he told himself no one was getting hurt." She stopped, swallowed. "I found out 3 months ago. I found a folder in the back of his filing cabinet." "Children." "It had the original survey reports in it, the real ones, the ones your brother would have seen, and it had correspondence between my father and Voss going back 15 years. "Children." Her hands tightened around the mug. "My father died in February, heart attack. He never told me. He left me the practice and the house and the filing cabinet with everything in it." "Children." "And I think some part of him must have known I'd find it eventually, because he left a letter too." "Children." "What did the letter say?" "Children." "That he was sorry, that he'd made choices he couldn't undo." "Children." "That the documents in the folder were the only copies of the real surveys, the ones that proved the fraud, and that he'd kept them because he thought someday he might need them for leverage." "Children." "Or because he couldn't bring himself to destroy the only honest record of what had actually happened." Petra's jaw tightened. "The folder is what's in the harness. The original surveys." "Children." 20 years of correspondence. "Children." Everything a prosecutor would need. Children. Dex looked at her for a long moment. The gray eyes were very still. Children. Crane knows you have it. Children. My father's office was broken into 4 days after the funeral. Whoever did it didn't find what they were looking for because I'd already taken the folder home. Children. But they found enough. Notes in my father's handwriting, references to documents he'd retained, to know the folder existed. She looked down at the flannel shirt, children, at the slight bulk beneath it that she had been carrying against her body for 3 months like a second heartbeat. I went to the RCMP first, children. The officer I spoke to called Crane's lawyer before I got to my car. Children, so you ran. Children, I ran. Children. Dex leaned back in the chair and pressed one hand over his eyes for a moment. When he lowered it, he looked like a man who has just been told that the thing he spent 12 years waiting for has arrived, and now that it's here, he's not entirely sure what to do with it. Children. You were trying to reach Sault Ste. Marie, he said, the federal detachment. Children. There's a staff sergeant there, Henny Koss. She's been investigating Crane and Voss for 2 years on a separate file. Corruption, tender rigging on public contracts. I found her name in my father's notes. Children. He'd written it down with a phone number and the word trustworthy underlined 3 times. Petra looked at him steadily. I don't have a phone, children. Crane's people found my car in Wawa and I've been on foot and horseback for 3 days. Children. Outside, something shifted. It was subtle, not loud enough to be a sound, exactly, more a change in pressure. The way the forest goes quiet, in a particular way when something large is moving through it. Dex was on his feet before Petra had processed what she'd heard, moving toward the window with a fluid, practiced speed that was startling in a man his size. Children. He stood to one side of the glass and looked out without touching the curtain. His face gave nothing away. Children. Snowmobile, he said, quiet, single, coming up the North Trail. Children. Petra stood. Her legs were stiff and the harness pulled across her ribs when she moved, but she was on her feet, and she was thinking clearly, which was more than she'd been able to say an hour ago. I have to go. If I lead them away from... Children. You're not going anywhere, he said it without raising his voice and without looking at her. You'd be dead in 40 minutes in that storm. He turned from the window and moved to the back of the cabin, crouching beside a low wooden chest. He opened it. Do you know how to use a sat phone? Children, yes. Children. He handed her a battered orange satellite communicator. There's a contact in it labeled NW1. That's a former colleague of mine in the Provincial Emergency Management Office. He's not law enforcement, children. He's not connected to anyone Crane can reach. Tell him where we are and tell him you need Staff Sergeant Henny Koss from Sault Ste. Marie contacted directly. He'll know what to do. He paused. Children. You'll get a signal if you go to the back corner of the room near the stovepipe. Children. Petra took the phone. She looked at him. Who are you? Children. Dex had already turned back toward the front of the cabin. He was pulling a heavy rifle case from beneath the bed, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who has rehearsed this in his head more times than he can count. Children. I'm Declan Harlow, he said. My brother was Raymond Harlow. He was the land surveyor who died on that bridge. Children. Petra stood in the back corner of the room with the sat phone in her hands and the harness pressing against her ribs and 12 years of someone else's grief suddenly making sense in the air around her. Children. She dialed. Children. The snowmobile outside cut its engine. Children. What followed was not the way violence looks in films, which is to say it was not clean or well lit, or accompanied by a score that told you how to feel. It was a door that held and then didn't, children, and a man who stepped through it and found himself looking at a rifle that could stop a moose at 400 meters, children, and the particular recalibration that happens on a person's face when they realize the situation they've walked into is not the situation they were briefed on. Gildren. Felix sent you, Dex said. It was not a question. Gildren. The man in the doorway was young, which surprised Petra, mid-20s. Maybe. He had the focused, expressionless face of someone doing a job, not a crusade, and that somehow made him more frightening than rage would have. He looked past Dex to where Petra stood in the back of the room. Gildren. Just the girl, he said, and whatever she's carrying. Gildren. She's not going anywhere, Dex said, and neither is what she's carrying. So you can tell me who sent you, or you can turn around and ride back down that trail, and tomorrow morning you can choose a different line of work. Gildren, a long silence. Gildren. Felix Crane doesn't negotiate. Gildren. I'm not negotiating, Dex said. I'm giving you an option. There's a difference. Gildren. Outside, the wind picked up again. In the stovepipe corner, the satellite communicator in Petra's hands emitted a faint tone that meant the connection had gone through. Children. The man in the doorway made his decision. It was a bad one. He went for the sidearm at his hip with the speed of someone who has practiced and never once been in a situation where practice ran out, and Dex moved in the half-second before the gun cleared the holster and did something economical and precise that put the man face first into the floorboards without the rifle going off. Gildren. Silence. Gildren. Hello, said a voice from the sat phone. Children. NW1, Petra said, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. My name is Petra Solano. I'm at a cabin on the North Logging Road, 15 kilometers above Wawa. I need you to contact Staff Sergeant Henny Kaas at the Sault Ste. Marie Federal Detachment. Tell her I have the Solano documents. Tell her I have everything. Children. There were 3 more of them. They came at first light, when the storm had dropped to a low gray murmur, and the trees stood out dark against the white in the way that makes the boreal forest look like a photograph of itself. Children. They came on 2 snowmobiles, and they did not announce themselves, which Dex said later meant they'd been better briefed than the first one, though not quite well enough briefed, to account for a man who had spent 12 years on this mountain, learning exactly where the sight lines were. Children. Petra heard the sharps crack once from somewhere above the tree line, and then a long silence, and then the sound of snowmobiles retreating south at speed. Children. Felix Crane was not among them. Children. He was in Chapleau, she learned later, in a meeting with his lawyers, because Felix Crane was the kind of man who hired other people to do the cold and difficult things so that his hands stayed warm and technically clean. He had been in meetings with lawyers, on and off, for the last 11 years, since the first fraud complaint had been filed and quietly buried. Children. He would be in meetings with lawyers for some time, yet only now the lawyers would be working against him instead of for him, because when the RCMP Federal Division arrived by helicopter at noon the following day, Henny Kaas in the lead. Children. A woman in her 50s with ice-colored eyes and the particular air of someone who has been waiting patiently for a very long time. Petra unwrapped the harness from around her ribs and handed over 22 years of documented fraud without saying anything at all. Children. The documents were everything she'd promised they were, the original survey reports, the correspondence. Children. A series of payment transfers that connected Aldrich Voss to an account her father had opened in 1999 and never touched and never closed. Children. A handwritten letter from Voss to her father, dated 2 years after Raymond Harlow's bridge, in which Voss referred to the surveyor problem as having been resolved. Children. And which any competent prosecutor could use as a foundation for a dozen different charges. Children. Henny Kaas looked at the documents for a very long time. Then she looked at Dex, who was standing near the stove with a mug of coffee and an expression that had gone somewhere else entirely. Children. Raymond Harlow was your brother, she said. Children. He was. Children. I'm sorry it took this long. Children. Dex didn't say anything. He looked at the fire for a moment, and then he looked at Petra, and what passed across his face was not relief exactly. Relief was too simple a word for something that had been waiting 12 years to surface. But something adjacent to it. Something like the feeling of setting down a weight you have carried so long you had stopped noticing it was there. Children. 3 days later, when the roads were passable, and a provincial officer came to take her statement, Petra sat at Dex's table with a mug of coffee and looked out the window at the snow that lay clean and unbroken across the clearing. The roan mare's tack was somewhere out on the logging road, buried under a foot of powder. She would not go back for it. Children. Where will you go? Dex asked. He was across the table from her, turning a cartridge case end over end in his fingers, the way people handle small objects when they're thinking about something too large to approach directly. Children. Petra thought about her father's house, which was still technically hers. She thought about the practice, the filing cabinet, the letter she had read so many times she knew it by heart. She thought about the particular silence of a place that holds the memory of someone you're not sure how to grieve. Children. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Somewhere that isn't running. Children. Dex set the cartridge case down on the table. This is a good place to stop running, he said, which from him was practically a speech, and she understood that it was not an observation about the geography. Children. Outside the window, the snow on the clearing caught the afternoon light and held it, bright and still and cold, the way the north does in winter. Indifferent to everything, and in its indifference somehow forgiving. Children. Petra wrapped both hands around her mug and let it warm her, and did not say anything, and did not need to. Children. There's a moment in Petra's story that I keep coming back to. Not the gunfire, not the frozen logging road, not even the harness strapped to her ribs for 3 months like a second spine. Children. It's the moment she knocked on a stranger's door in a blizzard and told him the truth. After 6 months of running, of lying by omission, children, of calculating every word she said to every person she encountered, she knocked on that door and said, simply, I need help. Children. And I think that took more out of her than any of the rest of it. Children. I've been thinking about what it actually costs a person to do the right thing when the wrong thing is so much safer. Children. Petra's father made his choice decades ago and spent the rest of his life folding it smaller and smaller until it fit inside a filing cabinet he never opened. He wasn't a cruel man. Children. He told himself no one was getting hurt, which is what people say when they've decided not to look too closely at who's getting hurt. Children. The consequences of that choice moved through time like a crack in ice, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. Raymond Harlow drove off a bridge. Children. Dex Harlow moved to a mountain and stayed there for 12 years carrying something that had no name. Children. And a young woman ended up riding alone through a northern Ontario blizzard with a folder of documents pressed against her chest, because her father finally, at the end, children, couldn't bring himself to let the truth disappear with him. Children. What strikes me about Petra is not that she was brave. Brave is too simple. She was clear-eyed. She understood what the documents meant, and she understood what it would cost her to act on that understanding. Children. And she chose to act anyway, not because it was easy or because she was certain it would work out, but because she had looked at the alternative and found she couldn't live inside it. Children. That kind of clarity is something you build. It doesn't arrive on its own. Children. It comes from being honest with yourself about what you actually believe, and then being willing to let that belief cost you something real. children. And then there's Dex, a man who had every reason to become bitter and closed, who had instead become careful and capable and quietly, stubbornly decent. Children. He didn't ask Petra to prove herself before he helped her. He read the situation, he made a judgment, and he acted on it, and he was right. Children. Because good judgment is what you develop when you've paid attention long enough to understand what actually matters. He didn't save her out of sentiment. Children. He saved her because it was the correct thing to do, and he had the skill and the steadiness to do it. Children. What I take from this is something I've had to learn more than once. Children. The choices that require the most from us, the ones where we have to stand up and hold our ground even when it's costly and cold and no one is watching. Those are the choices that actually build us into someone worth being. Children. Petra carried that folder for 3 months through fear and exhaustion and the specific loneliness of running from something no one else could see. She didn't give up. Children. Dex held a mountain for 12 years waiting for something he couldn't name. He didn't give up either. Children. And in the end, it was enough. Not because the universe rewards goodness on a schedule we can predict or plan for, but because people who refuse to let go of what's right tend, eventually, to find each other, and when they do, things that looked impossible start to move.